ISIS, or the Islamic State, burst on the international scene in 2014 when it took over huge swaths of Iraq and Syria. Today, ISIS controls a land area the size of Great Britain and is the wealthiest jihadist organization in the world. As it expands, Islamic State forces bring chaos and savagery wherever they go. Despite what we know about ISIS, there is much that remains mysterious until now. In his new book, The Complete Infidel's Guide to ISIS, terrorism expert Robert Spencer reveals everything you need to know about ISIS and how to stop its reign of terror.
Robert Spencer joins us now, and we welcome you back. Glad to see you. Thank you for being here.
Thank you.
What do people not know? What's the main thing they don't know about ISIS?
The main thing that they don't know about it is how everything that it does is based on Islam. Now, that ought to be an elementary point. This is a group that calls itself the Islamic State.
Yeah.
But the President and the Secretary of State, the Vice President, the Prime Minister of Great Britain, every authority in the Western world, and also the Republican Party, the opposition that ought to be telling the truth about this, they're lying to the American people. They're saying this has nothing to do with Islam, which renders us ignorant and complacent in the face of this advancing threat.
It's called the Islamic State, and yet the people in power in America will refuse to call it Islamic?
Yes. They absolutely deny the motives and the goals of this organization, which makes us powerless to stop it, because you cannot defeat an enemy that you refuse to understand.
We didn't have that problem in World War II. We recognized the Nazis for who they were. We went after them. But this time we don't do it. Why is that, Robert?
Well, I think that people think, people in authority think that innocent Muslims will be victimized by Americans. I have a better view of Americans than that. I don't believe that we're going to go around terrorizing innocent people if they tell the truth about this. But what the effect of this is that it hamstrings our response to this threat. Even though American Muslim groups have condemned ISIS, not a single mosque or Islamic organization anywhere in the country has any program designed to teach against its view of Islam. And so you got to wonder, they're not stopping American Muslims from going over there in any way.
The whole idea, for example, of beheading people, that comes straight out of the Quran, doesn't
Chapter 47, verse 4, when you meet the unbelievers, strike their necks.
Would you say that again slowly?
Absolutely.
That's all right.
Chapter 47, verse 4 of the Quran says this: when you meet the unbelievers, strike their necks. In other words, behead them.
Sure. So ISIS not doing something that's aberrational. This is core Islam.
That's right. That's considered to be the eternal and perfect word of Allah. And see, this is how they attract recruits. There are 30,000 foreign Muslims who've gone to join ISIS. That's an extraordinary number, and no other terror group has ever had that kind of appeal. And they do because they can show, look, this is what the Quran says, and we're actually doing it.
Well, you have a very intriguing thing in this book. You know, you wonder, those guys who get beheaded, they don't fight, they just go meekly along. Why is that? You pointed out in your book.
The Quran also says, strike terror into the hearts of the enemies of Allah. That's chapter 8, verse 60. Strike terror into their hearts.
Okay.
And so they want to do that by showing themselves as being this invincible force that nobody can resist. And resistance is useless. So they rehearse these beheadings over and over again. And they trot these poor men out and make them say their statements. And then they go back in. And so after 20, 30, 40 times of this, the men assume it's just going to be another rehearsal until the actual blade goes into their necks.
So they actually think it's just a play.
Yes.
But the real thing actually happens, but they don't resist.
And it's to create this effect that resistance is useless and there's nothing we can do. They're just going to keep advancing.
They have an enormous amount of money. They have set up like a government. To tell us about their money.
They have overrun so many oil wells in Iraq, and they're selling black market oil, and it's at very cheap prices. The surrounding nations, they see an economic benefit in it, and so they buy this black market oil instead of stopping this shipment. And this has made them, ISIS, the richest terror group in the world, and they have tentacles everywhere. People don't know that they're not just in Iraq and Syria, where they already control a territory the size of Great Britain, but because they claim to be the only legitimate government among Muslims all around the world, the caliphate, they also have territory in Libya, and they have gotten the allegiance of other jihad groups in Nigeria, the Philippines, Yemen, all over the world.
Well, they organize like a government, though, don't they? I mean, and
Yes.
the money is allocated the way a normal government would allocate money.
Absolutely. They have currency, they have social services, they have educational system, healthcare system. They're in it for the long term. They're going to keep coming.
The caliphate goes back into the Middle Ages. Talk about the caliphate.
The Khilafah in Arabic is the successor of Muhammad as the military, political, and spiritual leader of the Muslims. And there was always a Khilafah, always a caliphate in Islamic history until 1924, when the secular Turkish government abolished it. And then the Muslim Brotherhood, the Egyptian group, was founded in 1928, just 4 years later, expressly to restore the caliphate as being the only legitimate government of Muslims. And they have been, all the jihad groups have been trying to restore the caliphate. The irresistible appeal that ISIS has among young Muslims is because it actually claims to have done so.
Well, it was initially in Baghdad, wasn't it? I mean, wasn't that the center of the old...
Yes, that's right. The Abbasid Caliphate, one of the great Islamic empires of the Middle Ages, was based in Baghdad for a considerable period.
Well, when they've come and taken over territory in Iraq, does that give them legitimacy they didn't have before?
Yeah, and this has actually been a plan. You know, people think ISIS just sprang out of nowhere, but one of the things I show in the book is how the Al-Qaeda group in Iraq that was fighting the Americans 10 years ago, they planned to set up a caliphate in Iraq, but the Al-Qaeda leaders didn't dare. They thought the Americans would topple it, and ISIS split from Al-Qaeda, saying, no, they won't dare topple it. We can start this caliphate and keep it going, and they've been proven right so far.
How have we screwed up as a nation? What has our government done that they could have stopped this thing?
Well, we should be calling upon American Muslim groups to teach against this ideology. We should be reconfiguring our international alliances so that any foe of jihad is a friend of ours, and vice versa, instead of having these sham alliances with countries like Pakistan that are actually enabling and aiding and abetting jihad. But none of this has been done, and we're in complete denial about the nature and the magnitude of the threat itself.
Well, the president talked about downgrading, degrading them. That's not the way to kill those people, is it?
No, and it's not going to happen. He hasn't done a thing. The countries that have the means to destroy ISIS don't have the will. And the entities like the Kurds that have the will to destroy ISIS don't have the means. And he's even letting the Turks attack the Kurds, who are supposed to be our allies against ISIS, instead of fighting ISIS.
I'm a great fan of those Kurds. I think they're wonderful people and they deserve their own country. Do you agree with that?
Absolutely, 100%. But Obama has sacrificed them, as he has betrayed so many American allies, to another sham alliance, the alliance with Turkey. Whereas Turkey sees the ISIS as something they can use to defeat the Kurds who they hate, and then they will go in and reap the benefits.
What about Syria? The Assad regime is hung on by their fingertips, and you remember Obama said there's a red line that if they use chemical weapons, they've clearly used chemical weapons. What do we do with Syria?
Well, the thing about Syria is that if Assad falls, the Islamic State is the only group that's going to fill the vacuum. And so actually it would be in the best interests of America for Assad to stay there at this point, as noxious as he is.
The devil you know is better than one you don't know.
Yes.
All right. Well, it's kind of the truth. But he was an Alawite. He was a minority leading a major Sunni population. Does that matter anymore?
Yeah, it does matter, because ISIS is Sunni. And so they can appeal to Sunnis in Syria and say, you don't want this Alawite ruling over you. We're preferable. And they have gained a lot of support on that basis. And then the fantasy that the Obama administration has is that there are moderate Syrian Sunnis who will fight Assad and ISIS. And he spent $500 million of taxpayer money to train these people, and he got 50 trainees. And immediately after spending $500 million on these 50 men, he sent them out into Syria, where they were immediately captured and killed.
Are you serious?
Absolutely.
I mean, that's the number?
Yes, 50.
That's 50?
$500 million.
It's appalling.
Yes, it is.
What do we do in America? I mean, you feel so frustrated with this man who's in charge. What do you think motivates our president? What's going on inside of his mind, or can you determine that?
I think the president thinks that if he gives the Islamic world what they want, if he gives them a caliphate, if he gives Iran nuclear weapons, if he just gives in to them in every way, then they'll stop waging jihad against us. He really believes the leftist Islamic narrative that it's all our fault, and if we just would stop bothering them, then they'll be peaceful and calm. And this is a fantasy again, but it seems to be the only thing that makes his foreign policy coherent.
If there's a well-funded caliphate in the Middle East run by a terrorist group like ISIS, they will obviously have worldwide aspirations, won't they?
They do have worldwide aspirations. They've made no bones about it. They also see this as the titanic struggle between good and evil. They see this coming down to an Armageddon battle in Dabiq in northern Syria, which is a town that in Islamic prophecy, the final battle between the Muslims and the non-Muslims will happen. And they see that actually taking place within the next 10 years, and they're working toward it. Now, I'm not saying it's going to happen. I don't believe Islamic prophecy is real, obviously, but they're going to kill millions of people if they can in trying to get to that point.
But all we would have to do now is mobilize our armed forces, and we could crush ISIS in a few weeks.
Yes, exactly, like we did Saddam Hussein's army. And it would be the same thing. It would be a very easy battle, but we don't have the will.
I'm telling you, this book, ladies and gentlemen, is called A Complete Infidel's Guide to ISIS. It's an extraordinary description of what's going on. We're up against a well-funded, intelligent enemy that is taking territory, selling women as slaves, sex slaves, making huge amounts of money in oil. It's unbelievable. And it's in this book. So where do you get it?
Any self-respecting bookstore should have it.
And if they don't have it, they're not self-respecting, so don't deal with them.
It's also online bookstores, Amazon, and so on.
The Complete Infidel's Guide to ISIS. You want to read it. It's a good read and tell you something perhaps you didn't know.